All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going deep on a thinker who's pretty central to understanding, well, a lot of the ways we think about society and culture today, Max Horkheimer. Even if you haven't heard the name, his ideas, I think, have really seeped into a lot of the ways we critique the world around us. So for anyone who, likes to wrestle with those big questions about how things work, how they should work, this is going to be fascinating, I think.
Absolutely. Max Horkheimer, 1895 to 1973, really the driving force behind what became known as the Frankfurt School, and of course the Institute of Social Research, a place where some really, really groundbreaking social and philosophical thought emerged in the 20th century. A lot of people, when they think Horkheimer, they immediately jump to Dialectic of Enlightenment, which he co-authored with Adorno. A hugely influential book, no doubt. But I think for a philosopher, someone really interested in how ideas develop, you got to go back to those earlier writings, like the 1930s, Horkheimer. That's where you see the seeds of what would become critical theory. That's where the real groundwork is laid.
Yeah. And that's what we're going to be doing in this deep dive. We're going to be, tracing that trajectory, starting with those early writings, where he was working with this framework he called materialism. And then we'll see how that morphs and changes, evolves into that later critique of reason, that really powerful critique of reason and its role in, well, how we dominate nature, really. And the cool thing is we've got a lot to work with here. Essays, books, even some of his notes that were published after he died. It's a pretty remarkable collection of intellectual development. So let's just jump right in, shall we? Let's start with that early period, that materialist phase, and the program he was laying out for the Institute.
Okay, yeah. His inaugural address in 1931, when he became director of the Institute, it's a great place to start. Right off the bat, you see him emphasizing that social philosophy, it can't just describe social life, just offer these dry descriptions. It's got to interpret. It needs to really grasp what he calls the yearning for a new interpretation of a life trapped in its individual striving for happiness. That flags a key theme for him, right? The problem of suffering, human suffering. But he also frames it as a very theoretical problem, like a reformulation of the old question concerning the connection of particular existence and universal reason. So already you've got this tension, this pull between these really fundamental human experiences and this drive for abstract philosophical inquiry.
Yeah. And that early period is packed with these really foundational ideas. I keep thinking about that emphasis on suffering, on the desire for happiness. It seems like, a pretty obvious place to start. Like, yeah, of course people suffer. Of course they want to be happy. But he really digs into this. It has huge implications for how he positions himself, right, compared to other philosophers who came before him. I think the key here is that he's grounding philosophy in actual lived human experience.
Exactly. Like any philosophy that tries to bypass that, that tries to ignore the reality of suffering, the very human desire to overcome it, to get away from it. That philosophy is just, well, it's flawed. It's missing something fundamental. He actually says this pretty explicitly in his 1933 essay, Materialism and Metaphysics. He says, man's striving for happiness is to be recognized as a natural fact requiring no justification. And this was a direct challenge to how he saw Hegel. Hegel's this big towering figure, but Horkheimer saw him as sort of rationalizing oppression, like making it okay because it's all part of this grand historical unfolding of this thing Hegel called Geist. But Horkheimer wants to bring philosophy back down to earth, to ground it in that immediate, often pretty brutal reality of human pain.
Yeah. There's this interesting tension, though, right? I see this like between pessimism and a kind of cautious optimism in that early work. And you mentioned Schopenhauer earlier.
Right. Schopenhauer's metaphysical pessimism, that's all over his early work, from puberty especially. It's clear that Schopenhauer was a huge influence early on. This view that existence is just at its core full of suffering. But Horkheimer also keeps coming back to that human desire for happiness, for something better. But he often sees it, he often talks about it in negative terms, like it's more about the aspiration to be free from suffering. And that desire, that drive, coupled with empathy for the suffering of others, well, that's where he sees the potential for change, for social transformation. But even then, he's cautious, he's skeptical, because he also thinks, that yearning for universal happiness, it comes from a privation of the present, like we're always looking for something we don't have.
And it wasn't just Schopenhauer at play here, was it? This is the time when psychoanalysis is really taking off. Freud, especially. I feel like that had to have an impact on him, too.
Definitely. Horkheimer was very much engaged with Freud. especially that early libido theory, the idea that there's this inherent drive in us to overcome pain, to seek pleasure. He even writes about it in his essay, Egoism and Freedom Movements in 1936. And then there's Erich Fromm, another member of the Institute. Fromm was really trying to bridge Freud and Marx, to bring those two giants together. And Horkheimer was right there with them. That attempt to connect, the psychological drive for happiness with the social and economic conditions for real emancipation, that's a key part of this early period.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So we've got this base layer, right? That recognition of suffering and the desire for something better. But Horkheimer isn't just appealing to emotion, is he? He's not just saying, "Oh, we should all feel bad for each other." There's a real emphasis on reason here too.
Right. Feeling, emotion, that's crucial. But he's also saying, look, a lot of this suffering is caused by the way society is organized. It's irrational. And this is where Marx really comes in. He critiques capitalism for creating these irrational conditions that just lead to more and more suffering. And the really scary thing is he's saying that even the most efficient solutions, even if we're really good at getting things done, it's all pointless, it's all irrational if the goals themselves are messed up, if we haven't really thought about what we're aiming for.
Yeah, and you mentioned this idea of a social coordination problem within capitalism. I think that's worth unpacking a bit. For folks who might not be super familiar with economic theory.
Sure. So Horkheimer's looking at capitalism, and he sees this system that's driven by self-interest. Everyone's trying to hold on to what they've got, to get more, and they're not really thinking about the bigger picture, the social context that makes individual well-being even possible. He's saying, yeah, individual flourishing is important, but it's totally dependent on a healthy society. And capitalism, with all its chaotic energy, its focus on individual needs and desires, well, it ends up undermining the very thing it depends on. And that's what makes it irrational. That's what causes so much suffering.
And so he's proposing a more planned system, right? Something more like a socialist planned economy. That's the way out of this mess.
Yeah, in the early period, that's definitely the direction he's pointing in.
Yeah.
In Materialism and Morality, he actually critiques Kant. Kant, the big ethics guy. He says that tension that Kant sees between individual will and universal law, it's not some abstract philosophical problem. It's a reflection of the irrationality of the economic system. Under capitalism, there's no guarantee that individual competition is actually going to lead to a good society. But a planned economy, well, that could change things. It could integrate individuals into the work process in a way that actually benefits everyone.
So theory itself becomes really important here, right? Like the job of the theorist is to expose that irrationality, to make it clear, especially to the people who are suffering the most under capitalism.
Exactly. He's following Marx here, seeing the proletariat, the working class, as the potential agents of change. But he's also aware that just experiencing the contradictions of capitalism, that doesn't automatically lead to revolution. People don't just wake up and realize, oh, this system is screwing us over.
Yeah.
There are all these forces that keep people from seeing that. And that's where the critical theorist comes in. They analyze, they expose, they make those contradictions clear to the people who are living them every day. That's how you spark real change.
Right. And so this leads us to another key part of his early program, his critiques of metaphysics and science. It's like he's trying to find this middle path, right, between these two huge intellectual forces.
Yeah, he's very careful in how he navigates these two domains. So on the one hand, he's critical of traditional metaphysics, especially, in its Hegelian form, because he sees it as trying to explain away social injustice, to say, oh, well, this suffering is just part of a larger plan.
Yeah.
And he draws on thinkers like Delphi, who worked on the idea of worldviews. He says that metaphysics often takes these very specific experiences, these things that are tied to a certain time and place, and it tries to make them universal, like they're true for everyone, everywhere. And that just obscures what's really going on in human life. He also criticizes figures like Max Scheler, who tried to explain, well, pretty much everything humans do through this fixed idea of human nature.
Yeah.
Something that never changes.
But his critique of metaphysics isn't a total rejection, right?
No, not at all. He sees that at its best, metaphysics tries to offer this big picture view of society. And that's something that he felt was missing for the sciences, which by this point are becoming increasingly specialized. And this brings us to his critique of science, which he saw as suffering from, as he put it, chaotic specialization. He was worried that, scientists were getting so focused on their little corner of the world, their little area of research, that they were losing sight of the bigger picture. And he argued that science needed to be guided by reason. It needed to be directed towards addressing real social needs and ultimately alleviating suffering. I think his big point here is that if we just focus on what is, if we only look at the facts on the ground, well, we might miss out on what could be.
Yeah.
And that could really hold back progress.
Yeah. Yeah. And positivism really gets it from him, right?
Well, yeah, positivism was a major target for him, especially in essays like The Latest Attack on Metaphysics. He saw positivism as this attempt to make science pure, to cut it off from any kind of philosophical interpretation. And he argued that this just detached science from its social context. It robbed it of its potential to actually change things for the better, because, by limiting itself to just describing what is, positivism ignores the possibility of imagining and then working towards something better, something more just.
So what he really wanted was to bring these two things together, right? Philosophy and science, to get the best of both worlds. The big picture view of philosophy and the rigor, the careful observation of science.
Exactly. He talks about this continuous dialectical penetration and development of philosophical theory and specialized scientific practice. He's looking for a kind of social research that's grounded in the hard facts, the empirical data, but is also guided by theory. And that theory has to be focused on understanding and ultimately solving the problem of social suffering. He really believed that you needed both. You needed the insights of philosophy and the findings of empirical research to get a truly critical understanding of society.
And that leads us to, the way he thought about knowledge, his epistemology,
Right
and the
on.
way he thought you should actually do research, his methodology. He had a pretty sophisticated view of truth, it seems.
Yeah, very much so. He was both an empiricist, someone who believed that knowledge comes from experience, and a realist, someone who believed that there's a real world out there, independent of our minds. And he talks about this in his 1935 essay on the problem of truth. He says, objective reality is not identical with man's thought, meaning, the world isn't just whatever we think it is. And he talks about truth as being determined by the relation of the propositions to reality. So a statement is true if it corresponds to the way things actually are. But, and this is really important, it's not a naive realism. He doesn't think that we just directly perceive the world as it is. He's very aware that all knowledge is historical. It's shaped by the time and place we live in.
So that means that our social context, the situation we find ourselves in, and even our goals, our interests, they all play a role in how we understand the world, in how we figure out what's true.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He's saying that even when we're doing science, even when we're trying to be objective, there are all these factors that influence what we see, how we interpret it, the methods we use, the concepts we use to make sense of things. And all of that is shaped by the social and historical context. This is why he's so insistent on that back and forth, that dialectic between philosophy and science. You need the empirical research to get at the facts, but you need philosophy to make sense of those facts, to put them in a bigger picture, and to make sure that ultimately that knowledge is used to make things better.
It's interesting, though, because, the research we did for this deep dive, it shows that there's some debate about whether that program, that interdisciplinary program, was actually successful within the Frankfurt School itself.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, especially for someone who's thinking about how theory actually gets put into practice. Because Horkheimer, he laid out this compelling vision, but the reality on the ground, the historical circumstances, and maybe some problems with the methods themselves, they all kind of got in the way. And there are scholars, people like Jay, Wiggershaus, Wolin, they've argued that the Frankfurt School, even Horkheimer himself, they weren't always as open to working with empirical social science as they claim to be. And Bones, he goes even further. He says there were some real flaws in Horkheimer's his thinking about method and knowledge that prevented a true synthesis. He says that the interdisciplinary claim amounts to no more than an external formula for integration. Horkheimer spent more time saying why it was necessary than actually showing how to do it. And it's clear that Horkheimer himself would become more and more skeptical of that early program. Which brings us to his 1937 essay, Traditional and Critical Theory.
Yeah, traditional and critical theory. It's a turning point, isn't it? It's like a summary of what he's done so far, but it also marks this shift, this move away from trying to actually reform society to something much deeper. He's starting to question the very foundations of how we think. of reason itself.
Exactly. It's often seen as this manifesto,
Yeah.
laying out the core ideas of the Institute. But it's also a transition from that earlier emphasis on materialism to this new, more nuanced framework he calls critical theory. And the way he changes his language, it's really telling. He sets up this contrast between traditional theory, which he associates with Descartes, that idea of the detached observer,
Yeah.
and critical theory, which he connects to Marx, that engaged critique of the economic system.
And so this critique of traditional theory, it's kind of a rehash of his critiques of science and positivism, but with some tweaks, some subtle but important changes.
Right. He's still saying that traditional theory doesn't acknowledge its own place in society. It pretends to be objective,
Right.
but it's influenced by all these social forces, especially the power of industry. And the savant, as he calls the traditional theorist, well, they just ignore the suffering that's caused by capitalism, and they ignore how science often plays a role in that. But critical theory, it's different. It takes society itself as its object. It's not just about describing the world, it's about changing it. And it does that through what he calls immanent critique, which means, finding the contradictions within the system itself, showing how the system is undermining its own goals. And he says that critical theory needs to draw on the experiences of the oppressed, the people who are actually suffering. That's how it can have real emancipatory power.
You mentioned some changes in how he's thinking about metaphysics and science. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah. So one thing that's really interesting is that he becomes even more focused on the formalism of science. He critiques that Cartesian emphasis on math, on logic. He's saying that science is becoming too focused on these abstract systems, these systems that are internally consistent, but maybe don't have much to do with the real world. It's a bit different from his earlier critique, where he was more concerned with the mechanistic nature of science, the idea that everything is just cause and effect. And it's also interesting that the critique of metaphysics, it kind of fades into the background here. It's almost like it's been absorbed into this broader category of traditional theory. He does mention positivism briefly, how it was a reaction against the alliance of metaphysics and oppression. Like, he's still acknowledging that focusing on facts can be a good way to prevent philosophy from ignoring real suffering. But his main point is that traditional science, it just takes these individual facts and it shoves them under these big static concepts through this process of deduction.
Like, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. But critical theory, it sees the relationship between fact and concept as something that's dynamic, something that's always changing. He calls it an unfolding of a single existential judgment.
And it seems like this shift in how he's thinking about theory, it goes hand in hand with a more pessimistic view of social change. Like, it's not going to be as easy as he thought it would be. And the role of the intellectual, the role of the theorist, is becoming more complicated.
Exactly. You can really feel that growing skepticism in traditional and critical theory. He's less sure that we can just achieve emancipation through rational planning. He's worried that the oppressed, even though they're the ones suffering, they might not know how to actually achieve a better world. He even says that the situation of the proletariat is no guarantee of correct knowledge. So the relationship between the theorist and the oppressed, it's not simple anymore. It's almost like there's this tension. Like, the theorist has this insight, but they have to find a way to connect with people who are actually suffering. And then there's this really dark foreshadowing of his later work. He says that the commodity economy, the way we buy and sell things, even though it seems like it's making things better, it could actually lead to a new barbarism once we've really mastered nature. And that idea, that critique of reason, it becomes central to his work in the 1940s.
Which brings us to the Dialectics Project. And of course, Eclipse of Reason and Dialectic of Enlightenment. This is where things get, well, pretty intense. He's taking aim at reason itself.
Right. The 1940s Horkheimer.
Yeah.
Especially those two books. It's a huge shift. And for some people, it's a really disturbing one, because he's saying that reason itself, under the wrong conditions, can become irrational. It can actually turn against itself. And that's all because of what he calls instrumental reason.
Yeah, and I think that's worth explaining a bit. Instrumental reason? What does that even mean?
Okay, so instrumental reason, it's all about the means.
Yeah.
It's about the how. How do we get things done? How do we achieve our goals? But it doesn't really ask about the goals themselves. It doesn't question whether those goals are actually good or rational or even worth pursuing. And in Dialectic of Enlightenment, Horkheimer and Adorno, they argue that the Enlightenment, that period in history that was all about about reason, about progress, about liberating humanity. Well, they say it led to this triumphant calamity, and it's all because of instrumental reason. Because we became so focused on how to control nature, how to manipulate the world around us, that we forgot to ask if we should.
It sounds like those concerns about formalism in science, they're coming back here, but in a much bigger way.
Oh, absolutely. That drive to make everything calculable, to quantify everything, to control it, that's all part of what they call formalistic rationality. And they see it as the purest expression of instrumental reason. Because it's all about usefulness. Can we measure it? Can we predict it? Can we use it to get what we want? And anything that can't be squeezed into that framework, anything that's messy or unpredictable or just doesn't fit, well, it's just discarded. It's seen as irrelevant. And the scary thing is, the more we dominate nature, the more we shape the world to fit our instrumental worldview, well, the more that worldview seems like the only way to see things.
And it's not just science and technology, is it? It's like this instrumental thinking. It's everywhere. It's infected every part of modern life.
Right. Because, we're all trying to survive. We're all trying to get ahead. And in a competitive world, that means, aligning yourself with the right groups, the groups that have power. And instrumental reason, well, it just feeds that. Because it's all about, what's the most efficient way to achieve my goals? What's the best strategy? And that leads to fragmentation. Society gets broken up into all these competing groups. But at the same time, there's this weird homogenization happening. Everything starts to look the same. And that's what they analyze in that famous chapter on the culture industry in Dialectic of Enlightenment. They're saying that culture itself has become just another industry, another way to make money. And that leads to this standardization. Everything becomes a product. Yeah. And that's how dissent gets neutralized. Because anything that's different, anything that challenges the system, well, it just gets absorbed and commodified. It becomes just another product to be consumed.
And then there's that distinction you mentioned earlier between subjective reason and objective reason. How does that fit into all of this?
Yeah. So subjective reason, that's basically what he's calling instrumental reason. It's all about the individual, about their self-preservation. And reasonable just means, whatever works, whatever helps me get what I want. But objective reason, that's a much older idea. It goes all the way back to Plato, to Aristotle. It's about trying to understand truth and meaning within a bigger picture, a picture that includes values and norms and purposes. And Horkheimer's argument is that as subjective reason, as instrumental reason becomes dominant, it actually destroys itself. Because it loses sight of the meaning of what it's trying to preserve. If all we care about is staying alive, if that's our only goal, then what's the point of staying alive? It's like that critique of capitalism, that idea that we're destroying the social foundations of our own well-being. Yeah. But now he's applying it to reason itself.
And then there's that line about myth and enlightenment. Myth is already enlightenment, and enlightenment reverts to mythology. That's a head spinner.
Yeah, it's a real mind bender. And for anyone who's thinking about, the nature of knowledge, the nature of belief, it's really important. So what they're saying is that myth, those ancient stories, those explanations of the world that predate science, well, they were already a kind of enlightenment because they were an attempt to make sense of the world, to control it, to explain it. Mm-hmm. And they use the Odyssey as an example. Odysseus, he uses his wits, he uses his cunning to overcome all these mythical creatures, these forces of nature. He's basically imposing reason on the mythological world. But their point is that when enlightenment, when reason becomes dogmatic, when it becomes rigid and inflexible, well, it turns back into myth. It becomes just another set of unquestioned beliefs. Like the scientific worldview, if we're not careful, it can become this unchallengeable dogma, this thing that we're not allowed to question. And that stifles creativity, it stifles critical thinking, it prevents us from seeing other possibilities.
And this critique of instrumental reason, it seems like it's really tied up with this idea of domination. The domination of nature, but also the domination of ourselves, of our own inner nature.
Right. It's all connected. So instrumental reason, it's all about efficiency. It's about getting what we want. And that means controlling the world around us, turning nature into a resource to be exploited. But Horkheimer and Adorno, they're arguing that domination of the external world, it goes hand in hand with the domination of our internal world, our instincts, our desires, our need for pleasure. They're drawing on Freud here, saying that in order to function in society, we have to repress those drives. Yeah. We have to channel them into socially acceptable forms.
And they even compare this to certain ethical systems, right? Like Kant's emphasis on duty over inclination.
Yeah, and this is a controversial point. They argue that Kant, with his focus on reason and duty, with his rejection of desire, well, he's basically paving the way for a kind of total domination. They even compare it to Sade, the Marquis de Sade, who's all about the rational pursuit of pleasure, but that pursuit, it led to the subjugation of others, and that's their point, that the domination of nature, both the outer world and our own inner world, it ultimately leads to the domination of humans by other humans.
And you mentioned this word desubstantialization. That's a mouthful.
Yeah, it is, but it's a really useful concept. It comes from Lohmann, another thinker. And it basically means that instrumental rationality, it strips the world of its meaning. It turns everything into just a means to an end. So nature becomes just a collection of resources. And our desires, our motivations, they become, just these things to be manipulated, be controlled. We lose our sense of autonomy, our ability to create our own desires, to really connect with the world in a meaningful way. And they use this image of Odysseus as nobody in Dialectic of Enlightenment to illustrate this. It's like we're all becoming nobody. We're losing our individuality, our substance. We're becoming just cogs in the machine.
So this is pretty bleak stuff, right? It's a pretty dark picture of reason, of modernity, of where we're headed. Did they offer any hope, any way out of this?
So it's definitely a pessimistic view.
Yeah.
But there are these little glimmers of hope, little hints of possible resistance. They talk about the importance of theory's refusal to yield to the oblivion in which society allows thought to ossify. So the very act of thinking critically, of questioning the way things are, that's a form of resistance. And they even suggest that thought for thought's sake, just the pursuit of understanding for its own sake, that might have value in itself, even if it doesn't lead to immediate change.
And what about art? You mentioned art earlier.
Right. They saw art, especially modern art, as having this potential to offer what they call a negative representation of the world. Like it can show us how things could be by showing us how messed up things are. They talk about Joyce, about Picasso's Guernica. These are works that break free from the sameness of mass culture. They give us a glimpse of something different. But it's important to note that this is mostly about negation, about critiquing what exists. They're not really offering a blueprint for utopia.
And they also seem to hold on to this idea of individual resistance.
Yeah.
Even though it's fragile, it's difficult.
Yeah. They talk about some forces of resistance left within man, especially in the spontaneity of the individual subject. Those moments when we break free from conformity, when we assert our individuality, but they're aware of how hard it is to maintain that individuality. When you're constantly bombarded with messages telling you to conform, to consume. And so they often come back to this idea of solidarity, of finding connection with others through shared suffering. And that's where philosophy comes in, because philosophy can articulate that suffering. It can help us make sense of it. And that can lead to collective awareness. It's not the grand vision of emancipation he had earlier, but there's still this underlying hope, this belief that things can be better.
And finally, let's talk about his later work. After he went back to Frankfurt after the war, it seems like he became even more, well, maybe resigned is the right word.
Yeah. So after 1949, when he's back in Frankfurt, his writing changes. He's not writing these big systematic works anymore. It's more essays, lectures, notes. And even Habermas, who worked closely with him, he noticed some contradictions in those later writings. And you can definitely feel a kind of sadness, a sense of disillusionment. He's still reflecting on critical theory, but he's not as sure about its power anymore. He says that philosophy holds up a mirror to the world, but it's no imperative. It can't force change. And it's clear that he's lost some of that earlier optimism about theory leading to direct social action. He even says, philosophy has replaced theology, but found no new heaven to which it might point, not even a heaven on earth.
And this is also when he gets back into Schopenhauer, right?
Yeah, he rediscovers Schopenhauer. He calls him the teacher for modern times. And he admires Schopenhauer's, his unflinching focus on suffering, on the immediate reality of suffering. And he sees Schopenhauer as refusing to offer these false promises of happiness, of some perfect future. And that fits with Horkheimer's own growing pessimism. He's not as interested in offering solutions anymore. He's more concerned with understanding the problem, with really grasping the nature of suffering. And this also connects with his interest in negative theology, this idea of the holy other, something that's beyond our comprehension. And he sees that longing for the holy other, that's expressed in